Ho there, traveller. Perhaps, do you have time for a story? Now, this one is not a short story. Perhaps it is not to your taste. It is a Dawnish story. But a story long ago. Long before there was an empire to speak of. It is a little long. So I would say, sit comfortably. Get a drink. I have some if you need some. I will need it. And settle in for... Oh, sorry. My name is Galeas Seeker, a knight-errant and troubadour of dawn. And this story I have to tell for you is The Beast, the Knight, and the King of Wolves. First told and written by Arytan Vexille. Now, that's a name to conjure with. Are we ready? Are we settled in? For, other than drinks, I do not intend to stop until I am done. We'll see how that works. It is, as said, quite a long tale. Long ago, before there was even an empire to speak of, there was a certain house of Dawn in the southern kingdom, whose colours were oxblood red and mustard yellow. Their descendants no longer live in Dawn, but that is another story for another time. The castle of this noble house, let us call them the House Guildenstern for the sake of the story, had stood proudly to the south of a great forest since the first days after the people of Dawn chose the lands they would settle, halfway between the mountains and the sea. In these early days, House Guildenstern were led by a strong-willed and thoughtful earl, let us call her Earl Sauvignon, whose sole disappointment in life was the laziness of her only son, Mardisher, who seemed utterly unsuited to the challenging life of a noble of Dawn. In many ways, it was her own fault. Earl Sauvignon has lost the boy's father when he was barely a child, and in her sorrow had spoilt the lad. Even in the earliest years of the greatest nation of Dawn, a little favouritism was expected as long as the child grew up strong and clever. As long as a noble-born child could face and pass the challenges they proved they had become worthy adults, a blind eye was turned to parental indulgence. It would be easy to dwell upon the follies of youth, of dalliances, of casual disgrace, of truancy, of foolishness and strong drink. But I am sure anyone who has grown to adulthood would know the shapes such tales would take, and perhaps endure a pang of shame at their own malfeasance. Such things are expected, and easily forgotten when childhood is set aside. Instead, our tale begins on a certain night, when Earl Sauvignon Guildenstern was making preparations for a journey to the Court of Flowers, to answer the call of the monarch on the throne of thorns. The old queen was ailing, it was said, and planned to abdicate her crown while she was still able to enjoy the grand tourney and pass judgment on her successor. Earl Sauvignon planned to be there, accompanied by her wisest knights, her strongest witches, and her most stalwart retainers. She was, quite pointedly, not taking her son Mardisher. The Earl intended to speak at length with Mardisher before she left, to make one final attempt to drive home the importance of preparing himself for his test of nobility. In those distant days, the road to the Court of Flowers was by no means the safe journey it is today, and while the grand tourney was in theory for love, no savvy earl would make the mistake of assuming that death in pursuit of the crown was not a possibility. Unfortunately, the young scalawag was nowhere to be found. In fact, he had completely forgotten the meeting, and spent the night getting rascally drunk with the son and daughter of his mother's seneschal in a farmer's hayloft. The next morning, young Mardisher woke with an aching head and a churning stomach, and was pulled unceremoniously from the arms of his bed partners by Sir Galligan, a man who had risen to nobility from the ranks of the Yeofolk by dint of hard work and focused ambition, and who ground his teeth whenever he saw his earl's only child pissing away the opportunities his birth afforded him. After dunking the young man into a cow trough and holding him up as he puked his guts, he marched the scruffy young man down to the courtyard where the house had gathered. Every flourish of the heralds beat like a hammer against the side of Mardisher's head, and forced Sir Galligan to conceal an amused smirk. Earl Sauvignon looked down at him from her fine red horse, for in these days there were still horses in the world. The selfishness of humankind had not yet used them all up. And her lip curled in disgust at what she saw. The boy was bedraggled, still half cut, unshaven, wearing the wine-stained tunic he had worn the night before, and if truth be told, the night before that, with vomit on his fine boots and straw in his hair. He reeked of sweat and cheap wine and amorous pursuits, and seemed more annoyed that he had been torn from his pit than the shame he brought upon himself. The Earl leant down and grasped Marda's chin firmly in her mailed gauntlet, and spoke to him in a quiet voice that brooked no disagreement. "Promise me, Mardacha," she said to him. "Promise me that while I'm away you will see to your studies and your training. When I return you will be 15, and it will be time for you to either prove your worth under the sun and take your place amongst the nobles of my house, or find a good profession where you can serve the house more simply. Either outcome is acceptable, though if truth be told, one would bring your late father's spirit more joy than the other. It would swell my heart with pride to represent you as a true Guildenstern, but the path of glory is not for every soul. Regardless, you are no longer a child, and it is time to make something of yourself." The young wastrel nodded, and because he wanted his mother to let him go so he could be sick again, he swore it. He would attend to his lessons while she was away, he would train at arms and politics, and he would be prepared for his test and ability when she returned. Mollified, but sadly aware that any hope the boy would actually knuckle down was a triumph of optimism over experience, Earl Sauvignon Guildenstern and her knights and closest allies, all arrayed in panoply of burgundy and gold, left Castle Guildenstern for the Court of Flowers. Needless to say, after he had finished throwing up, washing himself up, and recovering from his previous night's amusements, young Mardacha had no interest in the training yard, despite the best efforts of Sir Galligan. Instead, rather than applying himself to some task of value, the spoiled young ruffian spent the day stealing apples with the younger children, who was quite effectively leading astray with his lax attitude and easy confidence. He then spent the evening avoiding his tutor in history, philosophy, mathematics, and politics, a learned yeoman named Marianne Summersage, who his mother seneschal had engaged at no small cost to educate the young Mardacha in the skills he might use to prosper at the Dornish court. The next morning, when Sir Galligan shouted at him, he made a half-assed excuse about being unwell, when wise Vela chastised him for his lack of scholasticism. He made an easy lie about being on errand for Sir Galligan and ran away. Instead of studying or training, he took himself out onto the greensward below the castle, where a band of scurrilous geysers, Varushkan peddlers, and merchants from distant Highguard were setting up their tents. He pissed away his morning and frittered away what coins he had, watching fire-eaters and jugglers eating sweets and hot meats, and generally goggling around the fairs if it was the finest entertainment outside the Court of Flowers. As the day drew on, however, he spotted several of the castle yeofolk combing the fair for him, and realised that Sir Galligan had not given up on his duty to the Earl. Indeed, Sir Galligan was fair set to grind his teeth to the gums, so frustrated was he. He was loyal, but he had been left behind at Castle Guildenstern to tend to a pissant wastrel, instead of accompanying his Earl to the Court of Flowers to contend in a grand tourney for the crown, an opportunity that came only rarely in times of peace. Should the Earl realise her ambitions and ascend the throne of the sun, she would have won her victory without the aid of Sir Galligan. Should she fail, he was sure it would be because her loyalist knight was many leagues away, picking an idiot boy out of a pig wallow. Young Mardacha was unaware of the troubles he caused Sir Galligan, and scampered away, helping himself to one of the baskets of fruit in one of the stalls. Had he known of Sir Galligan's frustration, why it is doubtful he would have done any different, but he would have felt a pang of remorse for the old knight. As it was, he set off to go fishing in the lake on the far side of the valley, well out of sight of the castle and its loyal guardians. Munching on sullen fruit, young Mardacha followed the path that curved up one side of the valley. There, high in the hills, was found a certain lake that rose from a cold freshwater spring in a certain cave, and was fed into the river that ran through the middle of the earldom of Sir Guildenstern. Finding a shady spot and making himself a simple rod with a length of wood, some twine, and a twist of wire, he speared a grub on his hook and threw his line out into the depths of the lake. He hit the water with a resounding plop. For a while he fished and had no luck. After a short time, a band of geysers from the fair came seeking shade to make merry. splashing in the water and engaging in foolishness. Young Mardicha took offence at this, and in his most imperious tone, commanded him to desist and go somewhere else, in the name of his mother the Earl. The guys just laughed at him, made rude suggestions, and would not share their wine with him. Blushing furiously, young Mardicha withdrew a little further along the bank and continued to fish. As he continued to have no luck, he became sure the geysers were mocking him. Each of their shared bouts of laughter, which in truth had nothing to do with the lad, who they had largely forgotten, he interpreted as a cruel judgment of his lack of skill, as an attack on his dignity. He was also jealous of their rough finery. These were in truth no common mummers, but clever witches from the south. Their fine green and gold attire marked them as allies of a certain house, weavers who in times of strife worked their cunning magic in service of the great nation of Dawn. In truth, for all their sport, each one of them had a truer understanding of what it meant to be a child of the sun than the privileged fool glaring at them from along the bank. In the end, Marge lost his temper. He cursed the lake and cursed his bad luck and cursed old guys and mummers everywhere. He cursed the sun and the selfishness of his beloved mother and Earl in leaving him alone to pursue his own ambitions. He proclaimed himself the most hard-done-by lad in the whole of Dawn, this boy who had the love of his mother and a good roof over his head, and had sweet meat and white bread and good red wine at his meals as often as not. Suddenly, the makeshift rod jerked madly. Young Mardicha thought he had hooked a huge fish, and cheered his superlative skill as a fisherman, and struggled with the catch. "You will not beat me," he cried, nearly falling over into the lake. The twine held, and the wooden rod bent like a bow, but did not break. And perhaps a wise lad might have realised this was not the natural state of affairs, and been more cautious. At last he pulled his prize into the reedy bank, and looked at it. It was not a fish. In truth, it was the ugliest thing he had ever seen. A wizened little creature, like a naked newborn kitten in outline, but black as pitch, oozing with slime, dripping with lake water. At its shoulders were peculiar sharp spines, like those of a hedgehog, perhaps, but at the tips, darker in a fashion he considered to be somewhat ominous. Despite being small, it twisted and flexed with amazing power, and tried to bite the young Yofolk on his hand when he picked it up. "Whatever kind of fish is this?" he said aloud. He was answered by one of the geysers, a scarlet-haired woman, her cheekbones dusted with golden scales, and girded in the manner of the enchantress. For the geysers had come straight from the fair where they had performed the tale of Sir Pellinore and the Sword of Ashes. Her band had been watching his struggle with his rod, and some meandered over, passing their jug of wine back and forth, to look at the no doubt huge fish the yeoman had caught. The geyser, poor sandwich, well versed in both the subtle lore of the night and the clear-sighted lore of the day, looked down at the wriggling thing, which certainly was no fish of any kind, and pursed her lips. She made a sign to ward off evil, and with a gesture dissuaded her fellows from coming closer. "I don't know what you've caught, young lad, but you must not let it live," she said. "A thing like that, so unnatural, promises only sorrow." Young Mardicha looked bullish, and demanded to know what he should do with it. The geyser shook her head. "You have no coin with which to pay me," she said, "and I fancy naught else that would buy such law from me. Take the free advice I have given, and be grateful with it." Then she and her companions backed away, and watched the lad sullenly from a distance, frowning and muttering amongst themselves, and making occasional occult signs in Mardicha's direction. Young Mardicha then realised he was alone among strangers with a reputation for being scofflaws and scoundrels, and far from any help. For the first time, perhaps in his life, he began to think seriously about what he should do. He raised his boot to squash the queer beast, but it hissed viciously at him, and he feared the soft soles of his shoes would not protect him from its spines. And truth be told, he worried that its juices might stain the soft leather and get him into more trouble. With some hesitation, young Mardicha put the creature into his basket and turned his back on the geysers. From time to time, as he walked towards home, he glanced again at the hideous creature and shuddered. He would take the beast to Sir Galligan, or to wise Marion Summersage, and ask for their advice. As he walked, however, a peculiar thing began to happen. His basket began to get heavier and heavier and heavier. Before he had crossed half the distance back to the castle, the basket weighed as much as if it was full of apples. another dozen steps, and it was as though the basket was full of stones. He struggled and sweated and swore, and in the end leant heavily against the fence, panting and glaring angrily at the basket, which still held nothing more than the tiny twisted creature he had pulled from the lake. As he caught his breath, his gaze fell upon the ancient well that lay in one corner of the farmer's field. Faced with the prospect of dragging the ever heavier basket all the way to the castle, it was an easy matter for the slothful boy to convince himself that there was a much more sensible course of action he could take. There is no way the creature can escape from the well, thought Mardasher. It will languish there and eventually starve to death, without anyone having to risk getting bitten or scratched trying to kill it. With that, he tipped the basket up over the well, and the peculiar beastie disappeared into the darkness below. After a while, Mardasher heard a distant plop. Satisfied, he went back to the castle and forgot all about the little beast. He was more concerned with the unexpected hiding that Sir Gawain gave to him when he caught up with him. Also, anyone had entrusted her trusted knight to take a rod to the boy if he ever misbehaved even. For while she had heard her son swear to knuckle down, she was too wise to entirely believe it. He was also more concerned with the curse that the otherwise mild mannered Marion Summersage placed upon him when Sir Berrigan was done, that made everything he ate or drank taste like ashes and brackish water, no matter how sweet or tasty it might seem, and it seemed to the Mardasher that for the next week the Yeofolk at the castle ate naught but fine food that he was utterly incapable of appreciating. Eventually, young Mardasher began to keep the promise he had made to his mother, more out of boredom than aught else to begin with. But his strange encounter at the lakeside had made him ponder for the first time what the future held, and suddenly the idea of remaining one of the Yeofolk, or worse, becoming a rootless vagabond turfed out by his mother to seek the blessing of the sun on his own recognizance, no longer appealed. For the first time he began to apply himself in the practice yard, and in the small library he went to bed with aching muscles and bruised of hard blows from wooden swords. He lay in the dark, head spinning with history and philosophy and politics. Yet he slept soundly, the sleep of a man who has tired himself out in pursuit of his ambitions, however half-formed and uncertain they might be. And also, for the first time, it became possible to see the man that the boy might become. While he was still sometimes left the practice field early at the promise of a dalliance with a pretty face, and while he still sometimes turned up to his lessons with a head fuddled with the legacy of wine and late nights, he had the good grace now to be ashamed of his failings, and seek to make amends for them, and as time passed he grew to something altogether different and better than might have been expected if one looked at him only as a boy. And as Mardasher grew, something else grew as well. In the thick black mud at the bottom of the old well, something abhorrent stirred. For while the young man had mostly put it out of his mind, the thing had not forgotten him. He had not died in the fall, and did not starve. Rather, as Mardasher grew and became strong, so too did the thing he had thrown in the well and forgotten about. In time, Earl Sauvignon Gilson returned to her castle. She had not reclaimed the crown of the sun, nor the throne of thorns, or the rod of rulership, but she had fought alongside the one who did. A new king ruled the court of flowers, and House Guildenstern stood beside him and rallied to his banner. As months turned to years, young Mardasher himself grew up. He passed his test in ability, and only just, for his mother set him a difficult and deadly task, as she had warned him time and time again she must if he was to be spared whispers of favouritism. He passed it only with the aid of stout Sir Galligan and the counsel of wise, clever Marion Summersage, and the assistance of Talia of the White Rose, a young questing knight from another house, who in time wooed him and joined House Guildenstern. But the story of that quest is not this story, and so must wait for another time. Now, young Mardasher became Mardasher Guildenstern, and you'd be hard-pressed to find a more finely spoken, hard-working, and gentle noble in all the provinces of Don. A terror in battle, merciful in victory, a loyal companion, and a cool head of whom it was said, even by his enemies, there is a man who can suffer a fool and leave him wise. With the blessing of his proud mother, Sir Mardasher Guildenstern mounted his great black steed, Brightmane, and took himself and his wife Talia and their squires off into the world in pursuit of the blessings of the sun and to spread the glory of his house to all of Don and beyond. The years passed quickly, but then things began to go wrong in the earldom. First, the shepherd found a half-eaten sheep. Then a week later, several sheep torn apart and scattered across the pasture. Then a week after that, the shepherd herself went missing. And then sheep and shepherds from nearby fields began to vanish, or to be rendered into lumps of bloody meat. Then the cows started giving less and less milk and became skittish. Then the first cow was killed, and shortly after the first cowherds likewise went missing. The villagers knew that a beast was among them, and went to the earl. She sent her knights out to find the creature and slay it, but there was no sign save the offal it left behind in the fields, and the empty chairs at the tables of those yeofolk whose fathers, mothers, or sons or daughters had not returned home. Then, one morning, 3 years to the day since that fateful afternoon when a son had decided to ignore his promise to his mother and go to the fair, they awoke to find a trail of blood and meat leading from a shattered cow barn, a barn that young Mardicho would have been more than a little familiar with, leading to the old well in a nearby field. They sent messages to the castle, and the earl sent Sir Galligan, his iron hair now flecked with snow, to see what had affrighted them. He followed the trail and came to the well, and with the aid of the yeofolk lowered himself into the depths. The well had run dry long ago in the time of Sir Galligan's father, and only noisome black mud remained at the bottom. Yet what the doting knights found there quite turned his stomach. In the flickering light of his burning brand he found the bones of at least 24 sheep, and a dozen people, and half a dozen cows, even a horse. Yet, apart from the bones, he found no sign of any beast. Instead, he discovered that several rough tunnels beneath the earth opened from a shallow cave at the bottom of the well, and there were signs that some rough beast was using them to travel around. Returning to the surface, Sir Galligan had the bones of the slaughtered yeofolk removed to due reverence, and then saw to it that the well was filled in with stones and soil, and returned to report to the earl that there was a beast loose in the earldom. Another month passed, without any disappearances, and Sir Galligan contented himself that the problem had been dealt with, yet his certainty was unfounded. First, the sheep began to sicken, then the cows, then the yeofolk. Clever Marianne, some say, traced the cause of the sickness to the river itself, whose waters served all the farms and even the kitchens of Castle Gilderstone itself. Some foul taint had touched the previously pure and potable water, a poison the likes of which she had never encountered before. Earl Sauvignon dispatched her most trusted knight to investigate once more, and Sir Galligan travelled the length of the river up to where it rose in the hills above the valley. As he climbed higher, the source of the taint became impossible to ignore. The river of fresh water that flowed down through the hills and through the heart of the earldom was thick with foulness and reeked of corruption. As he approached the lake and spring above it, from which the river rose, the stench became almost unbearable. Sir Galligan wrapped a cloth round his face, scented of sweet herbs, and even so he could barely keep his breakfast inside him. Muscles aching, for he was no longer a young man, and the climb was hard, he came at last to the lake where once a foolish boy had been wont to laze away his afternoon with stolen fruit and makeshift rod. Not that Mardicho would have recognised the spot from his distant, useful memories. The water was choked with filth, bones and offal and rotting flesh, and effluent of the worst kind, combined to make a cesspit of the once freshwater pool, so rich in bright-scaled fish. The foulness that flowed down to the river was explained, and Sir Galligan marked that not only was the lake corrupted, but that the falls that fed it from the cave mouth above reeked like the alley behind the tavern. Even as he watched, the source of the corruption emerged from the cave mouth, much widened from what it had once been. A great beast, slouching and full of wickedness, emerged slowly into the fading light, and glared down at Sir Galligan with eyes of sullen burgundy. Twice the size of a horse it was, enormous and fearful, with great talons on its feet, powerful enough to carve through stone as if it was soft clay. From its shoulders iron-black spines emerged, each one glistening with foulness. Over its back arched a segmented stinger, the bone-white prong likewise oozing a virulent venom. Its head, unspeakable, was part way between that of a cat and an ape, with sour purple-red eyes and an oversized mouth full of row upon row of razor-sharp teeth. Lithe and awful, the creature oozed hatefulness and venom and roared defiance at Sir Galligan as he gazed in horror at that well-begotten thing. Sir Galligan readied his halberd and roared an answering challenge. The beast let down then, springing with a natural force and grace, sweeping with its terrible claws. Sir Galligan met its charge of courage, and scored a terrible bleeding gash along the beast's side with his magical halberd. Sadly, courage is a poor shield against venomous spines and rending claws and tearing fangs. The worthy knight felt his strength ebb within as the beast bore down on him. Pierced by spines, stabbed by this thing's unwholesome stinger, his blood turning to fire, he fell beneath its assault and was torn asunder. His squire, hair turned white with terror, stumbled back to the gates of Castle Guildenstern as the sun set, babbling and weeping and spattered with the blood of Ilsevion's bravest knight. News of the beast of Guildenstern quickly spread to the lands of their neighbours. Some people climbed up to the hills to get a glimpse of the creature. Others locked themselves in their homes or collected their belongings and fled. By day the beast rested in its cave, but by night it descended from the hills and hunted across the earldom, stealthier than any great beast has any right to be, and more voracious than even the most hungry wolf. Nobody was safe from its depredations, and every week its foulness spread a little farther from the banks of the river that ran through the heart of the earldom. The beast's appetite was enormous. It took lambs and sheep and ate them whole. It developed a taste for milk and would suck a cow dry and tear it apart with its sharp claws. It lusted after the flesh of horses and tore apart any stable it could find. Soon there were few sheep or cattle or horses left in the earldom. Some brave knights tried to kill the beast, but were crushed or ripped to rags or bloated with poison, and either devoured or tossed into the reeking lake up in the hills to add to the foulness there. Stories whispered that even when they managed to harm the beast before they fell, the wound healed unnaturally swiftly, leaving behind only a fading scar. After each hero tried to slay it, the beast would roam the countryside, roaring its vengeance, uprooting trees, smashing fences, stealing children, devouring yeofolk and fouling wells. Soon the Earl made a decree, commanding that her knights stop trying to kill it until some more effective way could be found than beating it with sword and mace, which served only to rouse its murderous rage. Eventually, the beast's depredation brought it to the greensward below Castle Guildenstern. The local yeofolk were ready, wondering which from the forests of the north had come to the court of Earl Sauvignon and offered her his counsel. In the manner of the wanderers of the north, the vagabond witch had urged the Earl to come to an accommodation of the beast that tormented her people, for their sake, as much as for the sake of expediency. It tore at the Earl's heart to hear this advice, but it tore at her heart more to see her people suffer, and in the end she agreed to try the Varushkan's way. So when the beast came to the castle, the yeofolk filled a large stone trough with warm milk and tied 2 sheep nearby. As the beast approached the gates, it was distracted by the smell of the milk. It plunged into the trough and drained it dry. It ate the sheep with relish, and, well fed, it returned to its cave high in the hills. From that day on, the beast stopped roaming and killing indiscriminately. Every other day it would creep down from the hills to the greensward to find an offering of milk and sheep. The trail it travelled became marked by its passing, blighted so that nothing would grow save thorns and twisted weeds. Nearly a year passed. The beasts of Guildenstern grew ever bigger, and the people ever poorer. The land around the castle became barren as the creature's foulness seeped into the soil itself and poisoned the crops. The families of the yeofolk and noble alike dwindled, and no new children were born in Guildenstern lands. Then one day, a handsome young knight in shining armour came to Castle Guildenstern. It was a young Sir Marlicher back from his adventures, and with him came beautiful Marie, who was ripe with child, and while this was a joyous reunion, it was marked by the grim circumstance in which the earldom found itself mired. That night, the great hall was filled with people. "What has happened to all the trees on the south side of the castle?" asked the young knight. "Has there been war here?" A hush came over the gathering. Sadly, his mother told how the beast had brought them to ruin. Horrified, Marlicher realised this must be the same hideous beast he had thrown into the well all these years ago. That same beast that had devoured brave Sir Galligan, his mother's loyalist knights, and his own dear friend, who had become like a father to him. "It is my fault that brave Sir Galligan is dead," he declared, "and my fault our land is destroyed, and so is I who must rid us of this accursed menace." The crowd cheered. While Marlicher might indeed be responsible for the beast coming among them, his glorious words stirred their broken spirits and gladdened their sorrowful hearts. The Earl's son began immediately to devise a plan to defeat the beast. He listened closely to the story of its many weapons and of its remarkable healing powers, and he learned from its habits and its needs. Then, when he had learned all he could from the Yo-folk and their many nobles, he sought out a certain band of geysers. These travellers had given Guildenstern lands a wide berth, but Sir Marcher used the last of the Ealdorman's money to track them down, and rode his great black steed, Brightmane. For 2 nights and 2 days, he eventually tracked them to a nameless village on the borders of the great wild wood. The copperhead leader of the vagabond witches well remembered Sir Marcher from that day by the lake. She listened to his desperate tale of great beasts that ravaged his mother's lands, and showed little surprise. As geysers were wont to do, she had listened to the stories coming from the Guildenstern lands, and carefully considered what price she would demand for her aid. Once Marcher had finished his tale, she told him that she could not aid him directly. She could find someone who could help him lift the curse of which the beast was only the most obvious symptom. And it must be you that does it, she warned him, for it was your own broken promise and your unwise words that brought this foulness down upon your people. Yet do not think this aid comes without a price, for we are geysers, and what we do cannot sup on glory alone. What price the cunning geyser extracted from your noble I cannot say. Her kind are as dangerous in their way as any great and terrible beast, and those with scales dusted upon their cheeks are subtle and merciless as the great worms themselves. Yet, whatever the price, Marcher clearly paid it, for that very night the geyser took him to a certain spot that lay on the very edge of the great wild wood. There, beneath shadowed boughs, grew blood-red flowers that nodded in the chill breeze from the west. Among the scarlet blossoms stood 2 listening stones, leaning towards each other as if whispering. As the moon rose and the red eye of the wanderer blinked in the face of the drowned man, the geyser drew forth a golden key and worked a potent magic that opened a portal between the world mortals and another place, as far away as the other side of the shadow and as close as all that never was. Beyond the portal, Sir Marcher came to the court of the King of Wolves. Pale he was, and cruel, but not unamused by Marcher's plight and that of his people. Sir Marcher entertained the King of Wolves with stories of the dreadful things he had seen on his years of questing, and the King of Wolves offered him spoiled meat and soured wine, which, even despite the clever geysers urging not to anger the wolf lord, Sir Marcher politely refused. Perhaps the King of Wolves was impressed by the young man's manner, and by his tales, but the King of Wolves cares little for tales of glory. Perhaps he took pity on the people of the earldom, yet the King of Wolves has no pity in his heart. Perhaps he felt that the suffering wrought by the beasts of Guildenstern had run its course, yet truly the King of Wolves rarely acts to bring peace to those who suffer. Perhaps he simply saw the shape of things to come, and found them pleasing, and the King of Wolves is very wise, especially with regard to the suffering that lies in wait. Regardless, the King of Wolves offered to help Sir Marcher to break the curse his foolishness had brought to Guildenstern lands. You alone can kill the beast, said the King of Wolves, echoing the words of the clever geyser. I will give you a horn, so that you may issue a challenge it cannot ignore, though I will bind it to face you. Be warned. Once that horn is blown, neither one of you can retreat save that the other is no longer among the living. But before you can face the beast at all, you must make preparations. You must find the finest blacksmith amongst the children of the sun, and have a suit of armour made, with razor-sharp blades sticking out from its surface. And they must be cunningly made so that it may turn aside the spines and the stinger and the claws and the teeth. And when it is done, you must anoint yourself with a certain unguent I will give to you. When the beast's venom is upon you, it will not kill you, but instead will make you stronger, even as it burns your blood enough to drive you mad. When all of this is done, you must go to the lake and summon the beast and fight it. Sir Marcher opened his mouth to thank the King of Wolves, but that pale sovereign had not finished speaking, and his eyes flashed with anger that silenced the young noble. You must know that my aid does not come without a price. If you slay the beast, you must return at once to Castle Guildenstern to tell them of your deed, and let the King of Wolves help you perform it, and you must then put to death the first thing that crosses your path as you pass the threshold of the castle gate. Otherwise, this curse of the beasts of Guildenstern will seem like a balm compared to what will come, and you will beg at last for death to take you, and you will be denied. Sir March's heart quailed at the words of the King of Wolves, but he swore the oath to do as he was bid, for all it had grieved him to kill without good cause. And the King of Wolves smiled, and gave him a clay pot of foul-smelling unguent, a horn of white bone, and bid him to travel safely and arrive prepared to kill. As he left the chamber and the hill, the clever Geyser warned him that the King of Wolves takes such agreements very seriously, and cautioned him against attempting to deny the powerful spirit his due, or engage in base trickery. Yet Sir Marcher was barely listening, already considering how he might win the favour of the finest blacksmith in Don, and how he might avoid the certain traps set by the King of Wolves. And already the mark of the King of Wolves was upon him. The Geyser marked well that Sir Marcher's eyes now glinted yellow where once they had been green, and his skin grew pale beneath the weathered tan of the questing knight, and his strong teeth now grew sharp, as sharp as those of the beast of Guildenstern perhaps. And she fell silently, and spoke no more to him as he saddled his horse and departed that nameless village on the edge of the great wild wood. Then Sir Marcher took himself to the finest blacksmith in Don, she who wove starlight and fire to great wonders, who had forged the sword known as Sorrowful for the Earl of Tears, who had bound the word of wrath into the armour of the Red Bear, who had captured the last words of the troubadour Tamasan in the Golden Harp, and who was the fount of a whole host of other lesser wonders. The Earl of the Two Roads, as she was known to the other nobles of Don, rarely travelled far from her woodland forge, and there Sir Marcher found her and begged for her aid. She welcomed him as a brother, and for 3 days and 3 nights he was a guest at her court, dining on venison while far away the yeofolk of Guildenstern filled a trough with cow's milk and sheep's blood to sate the hunger of the beast. 3 challenges she set before him, and 3 challenges he answered, and she agreed to make a suit of armour that would turn aside the claws and the stinger and the spines and the terrible fangs of the beast. She withdrew to her forge, and the very next morning returned to Marcher with a harness of black plate, embedded with wicked spikes and savage barbs and vicious hooks. As her retainers girded him in the armour she had made, he looked more like a crazed butcher than a knight. And so it was, in his black armour of spikes and with the touch of winter playing upon his brow, that Sir Marcher returned to his mother's court. The yeofolk quailed to see him, and the nobles murmured, and his own mother blanched to see him riding across the greensward. But his beloved wife Talia of the White Roses greeted him with love in her heart and her voice. "He is changed," she admonished the court, "but life is changed, and if he is marked and if his bright armour is now dark, he is no less glorious than when he left us. If his eyes are yellow and his teeth are sharp, then they are all the better to see anyone who might threaten our unborn child, and all the better to defeat anyone who might seek to harm it." And with that she embraced him, despite the spikes and the barbs on his armour, and despite her belly round of child, and the people of the court hung their heads in shame, and welcomed Marcher back amongst them, and listened with wonder as he told them the tale of his ventures in pursuit of his ambition to end the curse. The next morning Marcher bathed and broke his fast, and poured out the unguent the King of Wolves had given him. The thick salve stung his hands like 1,000 wasps had settled upon them, and he shuddered at the thought of smearing on his naked skin. Yet he went ahead, and while his flesh burned at its touch, he covered himself head to foot, and once he was done and the pot was empty, the pain subsided until it was no worse than the sting of a wild nettle. His wife and his mother together girded him in his black harness of plate, careful not to brush his oiled skin with their own. The Earl bade him ride forth as the wrathful vengeance of House Guildenstern in the guise of the Knight of Woe, and his wife commanded him to take her with him to fight alongside him, but he gently refused, for she was great with child. He bid farewell to his mother, and to his beloved wife, and to the shade of his good friend Sir Galligan, and set off for the lake. On the far side of the valley, Sir Marcher stood on the banks of the lake where once he had fished away his carefree afternoons and wept. The lake was oily and thick, and more like some foul jelly than the fresh waters he remembered from his youth. Then he put the bone-white horn of the King of Wolves to his lips, and blew a single terrible note that echoed across the entire valley. In Castle Guildenstern, Earl Sauvignon and Sir Talia clung to one another and wept, for they knew the one that they loved now faced a battle from which only one could emerge as victor, and for all the aid of the King of Wolves, they knew the beast was terrible indeed. The beast emerged from the cave with a thunderous roar, its quills glistening and clashing together like spears. When it had devoured Sir Galligan, it had been the size of 2 horses. Now, fattened on milk and blood, it stood twice again as great, a leviathan of sinew and bone and seething, unquenchable hate. The beast seemed to recognize him instantly, and leapt forward almost gleefully. Its tail struck once, twice, 3 times, and while the armour turned aside most of the terrible force, he felt the terrible venom begin to do its work. Without the unguent of the King of Wolves protecting him, the young knight would have been undone, easy prey for the beast. Yet though his blood burned within him, and he cried out in agony as the fire rushed through him, he did not falter or fall. Indeed, the power of the King of Wolves filled him, and he felt strength as well as pain roar through his body. Seeing that the knight did not fall, the beast came thundering through the waters on the edge of the lake, burgundy eyes blazing with rage and hate and cruel hunger. Sir Militia Guildenstern met the charge and swung his sword, slashing and cutting the great beast. The creature leapt on him, bearing him to the ground. But the spikes and blades that covered the armour tore at its flesh. Screaming in pain, it tried to pull its way, but the hooks and barbs held it fast and tore at its soft underbelly. Its sword useless in such close quarters, Sir Militia drew a wickedly bladed knife and stabbed the beast in its shoulders and neck and face. He tore its belly and its throat. When it tried to bite him, he stabbed it in the mouth. When it tore it with his claws, his armour tore it back in turn. The more it tried to crush him beneath it, the worse it was sliced. The worse it was sliced, the more its black blood spilled on Sir Militia, and the greater his agony became. Yet he gritted his teeth and continued his butcher's work, hacking and slashing, stabbing and tearing. With one final blow, Sir Guildenstern pierced the thing's left eye with his blade, and smashed his mailed fist down on the pommel of the knife, driving the thing down deep into the monster's brain. As the thing thrashed and screamed, he pulled free of its grasp, tearing more of its flesh away on its wicked armour, and found his greatsword, and with a single blow cleft the thing's ape-lion head from its body in a gouting fountain of black blood. And to this day, they say the waters of that lake still hold the taint of that black blood, and that sinister geysers and forest magicians come from far around to collect them on nights when the moon hides its face, for they are a potent ingredient of curses that poison or rack the bodies of the just. And the knights of dawn kill them when they catch them, for some prizes are not worth the risk of gaining them. And in his cold hall, the King of Wolves laughs quietly and smiles into the darkness. Now, exhausted, Sir Militia crawled from the water and blew 3 more blasts on his horn. Now that the beast was dead, the horn was but a horn, and the 3 blasts naught but a signal. For Sir Militia had thought long and hard about the demands of the King of Wolves, and convinced himself that he could abide by the letter of his oath, yet spare some innocent from a cruel death, in spite of the counsel of the snake-scaled geyser. The 3 blasts of the horn was a signal for Earl Sognon to release Sir Militia's favourite hound, for it burned his heart to think of killing his loyal companion. To a better loyal dog die helping his master than any more yeofolk pay the price for the nobleman's youthful folly. Unfortunately, for some reason, Earl Guildenstern did not hear the blast of the horn. Perhaps the young knight was so exhausted his breath was weak, and the horn blast faded in the long distance from the lake to the castle. More likely, it was the touch of the King of Wolves upon the horn, spitefully ensuring that Guildenstern could not subvert his bargain. Unaware of his plan's failure, Sir Militia returned to the castle, battered and close to death. He was dismayed to see no hound. As he crossed the threshold of the castle gate, he blew another 3 desperate blasts on his horn. These the Earl heard and released the hound, and the dog ran to its master joyously, and Militia killed with 1 sweeping blow from his sword. But it was too late. And perhaps it was always too late. It is blasphemy to believe in fate, but sometimes the shape taken by events seems all too clear in retrospect. The shadow of that knight of woe who fights on the banks of the lake lies over that foolish youth who fishes lazily and believes all life is a game. The echo of that promise to the King of Wolves can be heard in the words spoken by the mother as she leaves her son. But the Creator does not touch the world, we are told, and the Eternals have not the power to shape human destiny. To talk of fate is folly. Put such ideas from your mind, and imagine instead that the doom which came was not inevitable, had those involved merely known more virtue. But it was too late, for the vow was broken. In the moment that Sir Militia hovered on the threshold, his brave Talia, the knight who had aided him on his deadly test of nobility, and who had won his heart, and taking his hand as he brought her into House Guildenstern, who had fought beside him and now with him had made a child, had caught him by the hand, and weeping tears of joy turned to announce his return to the nobles and yeofolk of the court. Perhaps the King of Wolves would be merciful, thought Sir Marcher. No true king would want him to slay his wife and their unborn child. No ruler worth their title would expect such an abomination. And what had the King of Wolves done anyway? The younger one had proved useful for sure, but it was the Earl of Two Roads who had made the armour for him. As to the horn, well, the hooks and barbs surely prevented the beast from escaping without the need for any notional magics. And the beast may have been venomous, but just how potent was that poison? Surely a strong young man like himself could have beaten the beast in spite of it, and so on, and so forth. And for the next 6 months, all was well. If the farmers noticed that the life was not returning to the soil, they were not so churlish as to mention it. If the cowherds noticed that the milk was bitter and made bad cheese, they were too glad that the cows were no longer being devoured to complain. If the shepherds marked that the ewes and the rams lacked any interest in each other, they were largely discounted, for shepherds are peculiar people all over, given to discussing the ins and outs of the mating practices of sheep. But after 6 months, Sir Marcher's first child was born, swiftly followed by the second. And while the younger son was whole and hale as any Donish bairn might hope to be, his older brother was marked forever with the blood of winter. His skin was white as the pelt of a great winter wolf, and his eyes the yellow of a cunning predator, and his teeth the sharp fangs of a hunting beast. And he did not wail and cry like a good bairn should, like his brother did, but lay silent in the cot, watching everything with cold and calculating eyes. And Sir Marcher's beloved Talia, who had fought ogres behind him and braved the politics of the court of the sun, and spoken poetry to him beneath falling petals of the rose arbor when they were wet, never recovered from birthing the child. Sir Marcher sent for weavers and chirurgeons and the finest doctors from the east, and for diviners and for seers, and offered a reward to any who might bring him a certain geyser who had once taken him to the court of the King of the Wolves. But the clever servant was nowhere to be found. And as the season turned, Talia of the White Roses was buried beneath a mound of green grass, as befitted a warrior noble of the House Guildenstern, and the summer flowers of deep burgundy and mustard yellow bloomed above her grave. She was not the last to go. One by one, everyone Sir Marcher loved was taken from him. As her son grew older, Earl Sauvignon caught a cough that would not shift with the spring, and by summer she had followed beloved Talia beneath the soil. And when his steed Brightmane, who had carried him through furious battle and desperate chase and across the breadth of dawn, suffered a fall on the bright ice in the practice yard, and slipped away in the night, and Marianne Summersage was caught in a fire that burned her beyond any hope of saving, and left her library in ashes. So in time Sir Marcher became Earl of the house, and his sons grew up about their mother, and while at first they were inseparable, in time they grew to loathe the sight of one another, and fell to feuding. And their feud saw one dead by the other's hand, and the greater part of the house marched west from dawn, never to return. And to this day it is said that the descendants of Sir Marcher Guildenstern are wary and suspicious of dark magic and sorcery, and yet are paradoxically drawn to it, and paradoxically brought to ruin as nearby as often as not. Riven in twain and broken, the last Earl Guildenstern was left alone and mad amongst the ruins of the castle, weeping for his lost youth and lost Talia, and all the sorrows he had brought upon his blood. And one cold winter morning, old Sir Marcher, final Earl Guildenstern, took himself to the war-shattered battlements to cast himself to his death, broken in spirit and sick at heart. As he lay bleeding on the hard, icy stone of the courtyard below, his spirit rose from his body, but did not pass into the labyrinth to which all human souls are bound. Waiting for him as his blood thickened and his body cooled in the snow was the King of Wolves, who spoke to him in a quiet, gentle voice. "You made me an oath, and you took my aid," said the King of Wolves. "Yet you broke that oath as easily as you broke your promise to your mother. An oath that is broken, even for a moment, even for the slightest flicker of a moment, cannot be repaired. I told you you would beg for death and be denied it, and I, at least, am not a liar." Then the King of Wolves was gone. And so they say the broken and crazed spirit of Marcher Guildenstern, last Earl of Beastspittle Lake, walks the shattered halls of his fallen castle to this very night, weeping for his lost love and begging the King of Wolves to show mercy to him. The world has turned and changed 1,000 times, and the King has shown no inclination towards pity yet. Oaths. They're an important thing. We really need to take value in our oaths, in what we swear, to be careful in who we swear oaths to and why. As Marlisha discovered, a broken oath is no small thing. Perhaps if he had kept his oaths, then he would not have lost his family. He would not have lost himself. And he would have travelled through the labyrinth to redeem himself and perhaps find virtue again. Now, it is no pleasant thing for any soul to be trapped, and whether it is true that he is not for me to say. But heed this warning, and be careful with your oaths. Be careful deals that you make with Eternals and other creatures. Be careful with your words and your deeds. Make sure that one hews to the other. And throughout, be virtuous. Now, I have taken your time quite a bit now, and perhaps it's time to be back on the trods. I hope this story has seen you well, and I hope you have taken something from it. Now, for me, it is time to move on, and for you, perhaps the same. See you on another travels. See you on a different trod.